G'day everybody, I'm Andy Marks, the Director of the Centre for Western Sydney, and we're here today for a Committee for Sydney member briefing. If this works well, it always works well if you hear very little from me and you hear a lot from our guests and of course from you guys. So please use the Q&A function and the chat function like crazy and give us your comments. But today is a very interactive session, so we're really keen to see what all of you think. We have some speakers, but before I get to those introductions, I want to acknowledge country. And as always is the way when we're connecting virtually, we're coming from different parts of Aboriginal land. And I think for us, it's important to acknowledge our reorientation with space away from the office and our reorientation with belonging. In doing so, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Today's interesting. If you have a little bit of a soundtrack in the backdrop, it's because I've got tradies around and they're playing Kiss FM. Now, when I was a kid in Western Sydney, when you had tradies around, it was nothing but Acca Dacca and the radiators. So Kiss FM is a bit of an interesting twist, and I'm getting more Jackie O and Kyle than I ever needed or deserved. But anyway, that's Western Sydney. Great to have you all here. I'll do a little intro of our speakers in a moment, but we're here to talk about Western Sydney, of course. And what have we seen in the last 6 to 8 months since we've, I guess, last got together? We've seen the state government step up in an extraordinary way, I think. And we really saw that leadership come to the fore in recent months, not without its flaws, but we also saw, I think, a preparedness in some respects, I'll be frank, more so than the federal government for state government to step up. And there goes a chainsaw. So I'm going to cut my opening short. And I'm going to go to our first speaker, David Borger, and I'll finish this opening off a bit later on. But David, if you could share with us a bit of an update.
Thanks, Andy. And I think the last time we spoke in one of these, I had jackhammers going on outside the window. So you've got chainsaws, so we're even. Look, I just wanted to also acknowledge the land of the traditional owners on which we're meeting today. I'm actually up northern Western Sydney in Alstonville, and I think that the topic of this discussion around how we build back better, how we recover, and in particular what happens in Western Sydney around this big opportunity of the West Invest Fund, I think is fascinating. It might be useful just to start with that fund. So what do we know about the fund? We don't know a lot about the fund. It's a mysterious fund at the moment. We know that there's $5 billion available. We know that whilst that was connected to the decision to sell the remaining tranche of WestConnex, actually the money might be coming from other sources. We know that the government is going to break it into two chunks, one of $2 billion for very unspecified priority projects, and the other $3 billion is going to be spent on a range of things, including local roads, entertainment, open space, and high streets. And it's probably the first time we've actually seen specific, real capital funding for high streets anywhere, I think, in New South Wales, other than some sort of pop-ups and upgrades. So that's what we know. We don't yet know what the process is for spending this. We do know that the Premier has made a comment that he's concerned about ensuring that he has best practice processes in place for ensuring probity in relation to this project. And we also know the governments have been mired and called out, frankly, by auditors general for a range of funding programs, sports, community grants, and so on. We're clearly actually in the government's own terms, they've said pork barrelling is a legitimate part of the political process. I don't think that's going to cut it anymore. I do think that the Premier is being genuine in saying he's concerned and worried about this. So that doesn't give us really much insight as to how we're going to spend it. So I think the idea of the committee in getting this group together to talk about what we should do is timely. I guess from my own point of view, I would argue a few principles that I think are important, and you may disagree. The first one I'd argue is that with this $5 billion, we should seek to achieve transformational impact, projects that actually are really going to create a ripple effect in our communities in Western Sydney and are bigger than themselves. And I would certainly urge that governments do not spread things too thinly into hundreds of tiny projects, because I think ultimately they almost can't be strategic. And focusing, I think, on the city centres of Western Sydney. When I think of the challenges of Western Sydney, I think one of the big challenges is the challenge of amenity in attracting human capital. And we have many large city centres, Liverpool, Campbelltown, Penrith, Parramatta, etc., I think they should be our focus. I think they have been the forgotten family members in Western Sydney, and this sort of funding might be able to improve amenity. One of the things that's held back investment in those places is that the feasibility of projects, whether it's cultural, civic, retail, sometimes residential, certainly offices, they haven't really stacked up. They haven't stacked up. They haven't delivered the jobs, nirvana, the polycentric city we wanted. So how do we turn that around? And one of the things I think we can focus on is really building great amenity in those city centres. So I would certainly argue that funding in those centres should be given a priority. And it may be that government says, well, look, 70% of the funds will go on just those few large centres where we can have real impact for the community, and the rest might be shared more broadly for those smaller projects. I think the other thing we should think about is the opportunity for leverage. So how can we actually create more than just the pie that the government has made available? Are there opportunities for the private sector to bring forward their investments if certain things happen? Is there an opportunity for finance to grow the pie? Is there an opportunity for local government perhaps to make co-contributions, institutions, universities, and other groups? And I certainly think in any funding scheme, you would have to say you should probably give an extra tick if someone can turn $100 million of investment into Western Sydney into $500 million of investment. So I think leverage is fairly important. Probably the other thing that's important is whether this is a stimulus project or not, and we don't really know. We know that certainly when it was first announced, the government said there should be an element of stimulus and recovery because the areas of concern, mainly in Western Sydney, did it so tough. So the challenge, of course, with stimulus funding is often not strategic. It's actually the thing that you got ready for the shovel to put in the ground. It's the project that's in the top of the drawer, which has actually gone through all the approval processes and the engineering details and whatever, and it's ready to go. Doesn't mean that it's strategic or transformational. So I think that's a bit of a challenge in this, how the government balances between the need to do things quickly in order to create economic activity and income and a multiplier effect, and how much we are actually going to be strategic about this. And I'm actually unsure of that myself. I certainly see the need for stimulus in some areas, but I think if it's all spent purely on stimulus activities, it won't be strategic and it won't be transformational. And I think the other thing that's important here is that we've mentioned the arts. I mean, Western Sydney is an area that has one of the lowest expenditures on culture of the arts of any precinct within New South Wales. We do pay taxes. We're a big chunk of the population, pay a lot of taxes, but often we're leading very busy lives, paying off double mortgages or high rents or whatever it is. And the physical challenge of actually getting into the great cultural institutions in Sydney CBD is beyond most people. So I think we need to build opportunities for cultural capital in Western Sydney. And again, I think they probably need to be around those major centres. Building the Powers Museum in Parramatta is something that I've always supported. I think it's fantastic, but we need to go beyond that. And there are big regions in Western Sydney which don't even have the opportunities for entertainment, and it's too far to get to Curtis Bank Arena in the middle of Olympic Park. I mean, the Southwest, I think, needs something like that. So as does the Outer West. So Andy, I might stop it there. I don't know how much I've taken up of my 7 minutes of allocated time, but I think we should be united on this. And I think if we united, government will listen to us, and we shouldn't miss this opportunity. And one final thing is if there can be great legacy labour market programs that are attached to this, so you do leave a legacy of skill building for young kids in Western Sydney, that'd be great too. Thanks, Andy.
Great, thanks, David. You be pleased to know that you outlasted the chainsaw too at that great points. Actually, I really loved your point on leverage too. How do we turn $5 billion into something even more, impactful and impressive? And that's something I hadn't considered. I think understanding the need for scrutiny too, given the challenges we've had around government expenditure. I think recent developments have made everybody very aware federally and at the state level of the importance of doing these things on the basis of evidence, so that the communities that actually do need that support and will benefit from it are the ones that actually get it. I think also the only other point I would add would be the lessons that we've learned from lockdown. So, and I don't mean necessarily what we might describe as the challenges. I actually mean some of the things where communities really proved incredibly resilient. I'm thinking of areas of Blacktown, of southwestern Sydney, where against all odds, those communities showed up. I remember when they were looking to do a hard lockdown on Blacktown. I was speaking to somebody who said the nearest access to vaccination was in Penrith, you know, and it was really ironic that these things weren't sort of established in the heart of those communities. And we had those challenges as well around the lack of in-language information and consistent in-language information. I think I'd extend your arts piece to include almost a sort of arts and cultural focus as well. And by cultural, I mean supporting some of the great entities that are out there, like the Migrant Refugee Resource Centre and others that do wonderful work through Western Sydney. But really excellent points, David. You don't get 5 billion land in your pot every day, so we need to be strategic, and I agree we need to be unified. Which really leads me on to our next speaker. We're really, really delighted to have Denis Sora join us, Chief Executive of the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust and Australian Institute of Botanical Sciences. I thought universities had long titles, Denise. That's a cracker.
Hang on, I make most of them up as they go along, Andy, really. It's a good one.
All well deserved. But look, I'll hand over to you. Same rules apply. Go as short or as long as you like, and then we'll have questions during and after, of course. Yeah, over to you, Denise.
Never give me free rein because I'll talk forever, but I'll be really, really good. I have got some slides and I'll move through them really quickly, but really lovely to see everyone. The focus, I just want to do a bit of a, I guess, an education on what the Royal Botanic Gardens and Domain Trust is, but really focus in my conversation on Western Sydney and just some of the opportunities that we've lessons learned, but also understanding that Botanic Gardens are really not just a green space. So bear with me. Hopefully this happens quicker. Let me know if everyone can see it. I hope we should be going on to a main. Is that right? I'll go backwards. It's good. Probably started at the end, so I'll flick through, right? Okay, so just so you know, we're actually made up of, on the left, we've got the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan, obviously 416 hectares of amazing green space, but also consideration of one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, because we have our herbarium collection and also our seed bank, and our seed bank actually holds 65% of New South Wales threatened species. We are, in essence, a botanic garden, the oldest scientific institution in Australia. And Mount Annan, to me, in that Western Parkland city, has an enormous opportunity, and I'm always the first one to have my hand out for money. And so I think we can do a lot there, and I'll come back to that, but I just want to talk about some of the things we're known for. Next to that picture, that second to the right, is the Blue Mountains Botanic Garden, and that's the only cool climate botanic garden in Australia. And it sits obviously within our World Heritage Site at the Blue Mountains. And then we've got the Domain. People don't realise the Domain is very connected to the Royal Botanic Garden Sydney, but the Domain is its own national heritage area, and probably one of the most busiest cultural, and I talk cultural because we are a cultural institution as well as a scientific institution. And, you know, our major events that happen in that space, you know, with carols and things like that, and New Year's Eve. And what I want is that same experience. And David, what you just talked about is so important. How do you access that? And I think Annan can become a great cultural institution for open events and things like that. And then obviously the last pictures that everyone knows, the Royal Botanic Garden Sydney, and we get over 5 million visitors a year. Obviously it's been a massive hit during lockdown, because we haven't had any international tourists. So they're quite incredible spaces. I have about 320 staff, obviously made up everywhere from horticulturists, scientists, through to, you know, corporate service, governance, etc. Just wanted to sort of, I guess, reiterate the scientific side that we have with the research we do is very much in about threatened species, identification, and botanic gardens around the world. And we link really closely with Kew Gardens and several other major botanic gardens around the world in understanding that about 40% of plant species are actually threatened with extinction. And the United Nations Sustainable Goals, one of those key things that we're all working on is to actually increase the collections that we have, and we call them our living collections. So we have preserved and living, but we would like to have at least 75% of all species in botanic gardens around the world. So it's just so you know, we're a very global platform as well. We are very much about education. We run incredible education programs, and we have some really awesome programs at Mount Annan, particularly leading to Australian fauna and flora, which is really interesting because we've got so many different marsupials at Mount Annan. And we run what I would call classes from cradle to grave. So that's everything we want to do is talk about plants, but the importance of plants, and that if you don't have plants, you actually don't have any life on Earth. So we try and make that grand statement, and we'll own it. But it's a very important mission on critical environmental challenges. We are all about displays. The one on the right is our calyx at Sydney, but behind me is my paper daisy display, and also one of the pictures in there at Mount Annan. It draws so many people when we have our spring displays, and I cannot begin to tell you how many people have come this year. And Mount Annan's visitation in the last 2 years has actually increased from about 500,000 to 750,000 people. It's incredible. It is so busy, and the investment in that space is crucially needed because of the growing population that will come. And the other important role for us, we have about to launch our Innovate Reconciliation Action Plan and our First Nations engagement strategy. Putting country first is very important for us, because the land that our gardens are all on, and also our learning and knowledge comes from tens of thousands of years, not the last 200 years as a scientific institution. And we have a really close community at Mount Annan in that space with our Darryl, and it's Uncle Ivan there is a very important and wonderful person who supports us greatly. So there's lots and lots of things we're working on as part of our First Nations engagement strategy. And then we're about events, and this is where I think the diversity of use. So all of these, I've got my Tomato Festival, the Tomato Longest Lunch, I've got the Christmas carols, we've got the Beer Festival, Sydney. So many of these events are all at Sydney in the Domain. And we have to change the way we work with the councils, and particularly with Camden and Campbelltown, and Lindy and Ron are like wonderful supporters, and we're working on new DAs to create more events and bring a greater diversity, so that the operators actually stop just wanting to put it all in the CBD. They need to come out to Western Sydney, because that's where the growth is. And what they think is the money's not there, but that's wrong. If we've got the right transport, the right connections, and the right facilities, we can do some amazing things. Now, this is a sneak preview. No one else has really seen this, only a very close thing. This is our vision for Mount Annan, to become probably one of the key global destinations linked with obviously the aerotropolis, bringing in international visitors, but more importantly, that growth area up to 2036, that it's going to go to about 1.1 million individuals in that Western Parkland City area. This is their backyard. And 416 hectares broken down into science space, eco-accommodation. We want to use the biodomes to create great understanding of, I guess, a curation of ecological outcomes. And then we have this lakes precinct, and we want to create an event space with a sound shell in the middle of the stage where people can come. And you can imagine, I guess, like the Hope Estate, we have this type of experience that's similar to up near the Hunter Valley. And also bringing back country. And it's really important to me to restore Darryl country back. So we'll have this farm market, native land practices, and the types of experiences at restaurants. This is a $350 million 10, 15-year plan that I will be pushing really, really hard as an investment, because if we're going to talk about leverage and creating legacy, then this space will become a wonderful, wonderful legacy for the people of Western Sydney. So that's me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Bringing back country. Actually, I just think that, trailing off David's points about arts and culture, and I guess having those spaces re-energised for Western Sydney, Denise, it's really exciting to hear that. It's good to see that you're a champion for getting some of the events out of town and into the West. We're all champions for that, I think, here. And certainly, I think there are so many opportunities to do things in Western Sydney in your spaces that we can't afford to miss them. So fantastic. We've seen what a great success, for example, Tropfest has been by way of an event moving out to Western Sydney. Let's not stop there. So look, I've jumbled everything up out of order, which is what I do. And my apologies for anyone who was prepped and ready to roll. But Beck, just so you're aware, I'm coming to you in a moment. I think that for what we're facing in Western Sydney in terms of recovery, there is a temptation to think about things purely from an economic lens, but I think it's so important that in doing so that we actually think about a very people-centred and community-centred way of doing things. And I think that's the strength that I've seen in Campbelltown in recent years. And, you know, Rebecca Grasso, who's our next presenter, is the Director of City Growth for Campbelltown City Council. And growth is a tricky word because growth has both negative and positive connotations. And I think in the context of what we've just seen in Glasgow, the way that we manage growth has to be based in a really sustainable mindset. And certainly there's no area of Greater Sydney, and in fact, there's very few areas, if any, in Australia that are growing as fast as outer southwestern Sydney, in Campbelltown and the Macarthur region. And Rebecca's doing an amazing job with Lindy and the team in ensuring that that growth happens in a sustainable, but really importantly, a really inclusive way. And councils can consult to death. We've all heard about how their planning processes can be slowed up by those types of frameworks. It's different at Campbelltown because it's a genuine inclusiveness, I think, in the way that they do community consultation. And Rebecca's been a really great champion for that. So I'm delighted to hand over to Rebecca Grasso to tell you all about it.
Thanks very much, Andy. I appreciate that introduction and the really great segue. I do just want to confess, though, that my very first breakout of my 5K bubble was to the Mount Annan Botanic Gardens, and it was just delightful. Blue sky, cotton wool cloud day, seeing some real humans and just soaking up that amazing environment was a really, really good way to break out of my little bubble. So thank you very much, Denise. So I wanted to talk about resilience, community recovery and Campbelltown's experience. So COVID has had a really wide-ranging impact, and put in context with other recent disasters, you know, the drought, the flood and the bushfires that we've had over the last little while, our experience and our instinct has caused our response to be considered through a crisis lens as an emergency. And if we think about these as acute shocks, there are some measures that we can take to reduce their likelihood of occurrence and the impact that they do occur. And it can be said that we really haven't had much of a chance to regroup and regather in between these crises before the next acute shock has occurred. And it would be lovely to pause and regroup and recover and mitigate the impact and prepare for the next crisis, but it just doesn't happen that way. So we need to make sure that we're doing that work in parallel. So that means planning ahead for the next crisis before the current crisis is over. So during both COVID lockdowns, Campbelltown Council's coordinated its community and business support through a 30-strong cross-functional team. And during the first lockdown, we realised that it was more than a crisis and that we needed to take a really holistic approach and have an agile way of thinking about what our response was, but also really understanding what were the issues that we were trying to solve as well. And so resilience actually provides that framework for us. It recognises the importance of preparation, recovery, and places people at the centre. So we define resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive no matter what kind of chronic stress or acute shocks they're experiencing. So acute shocks are sudden, short-term events that disrupt individuals, communities, institutions, and organisations, businesses, and systems. And chronic stresses are those that weaken systems and communities on a day-to-day or a cyclical basis. Resilience seeks to ensure that a city thrives in good times and bad for the benefit of all of its residents. So understanding those chronic stresses is absolutely critical because it's the chronic stresses that are exacerbated by the shocks. And that's been clearly demonstrated through COVID as most of our vulnerable communities and people have suffered the most. So we undertook to understand the specific hazards to the Campbelltown community. And by recognising these hazards, it helps us identify where we can best invest our efforts. So just before the 2021 lockdown, we completed a resilience hazard assessment, identifying the current and emerging shocks stresses and resilience hazards with the greatest potential to disrupt our community and our organisational operations. And building on the insights from the assessment, we've developed an action plan that describes the things that we need to do to prepare and the opportunities that we can embrace, with the goal of thriving as a community, not just surviving. So importantly, and this goes back to a point that David made earlier too, we've established our plan with evidence. It's how do we actually make sure we're using data and evidence to inform the decisions that we make for our recovery? How do we best invest the West Invest? We can only really know that we're doing that if we understand the problems that we're trying to solve and we use data to make that happen. So really what we've found is that good intentions just aren't enough. We really need to make sure that we're founding decisions on good sense. So one of the beauties of looking through the resilience lens is that the light's shone on what we can do to have the biggest impact, including the opportunities that emerge through challenge. So it's not just all doom and gloom. It is actually about really capitalising on some of those great things that we've had insight of through COVID. Just back on the resilience hazard assessment that we've done in Campbelltown, there were 3 of the 7 hazards that we identified that were particularly evident through COVID. The first one was severe disruption to services, infrastructure and assets that support our city and its people. The second, health and community services are overwhelmed, and I think that wasn't certainly isolated to Campbelltown, that was across the board. And critical infrastructure doesn't meet or keep up with changing community demands, and that's something that we need to keep a constant eye on. So just some insights into the impact of COVID-19 in Campbelltown. The first one that really hit us was the digital divide. Many residents can't meet basic digital needs, and some of the causes for that include access, so the simple availability of internet and connected devices, affordability, so the means to get online and obtain devices, and also digital ability, so the confidence to use technology safely. So we know through census and other research that Campbelltown, and particularly southwestern Sydney, has some of the lowest digital access. So 14.8% of households didn't have internet at home. And that seems quite amazing to people who take it for granted. And the lowest percentage of homes without internet were absolutely our most vulnerable and disadvantaged suburbs. We undertook a survey, and 13 local schools took part in this survey in July 2021, and they indicated that 61.5% of their students experienced difficulties accessing technology and digital devices. Now, that is absolutely terrifying. When you think of the impact of the lockdown on school, and the fact that so many children quite simply did not have access to devices or technology to be able to learn, we're not going to actually see the impact of that for some time yet. I know school's back, but I'm quite sure that there's going to be some significant legacy issues with that. The next one is social isolation, and particularly for our elderly people. We know that many of them, more than half actually, don't have digital connectivity, and many are without independent transport. So that's a real concern for our local community. Food security, also not isolated to Campbelltown. So food insecurity rarely occurs in isolation, and it's often associated with other stresses such as material hardship and inadequate financial resources, but also where people have difficulty accessing affordable, healthy food, and where people have limited food and nutrition literacy, so knowing how to prepare and purchase and prepare a healthy meal. So there was considerable support provided. The community really galvanised both businesses and community organisations to provide both food hampers and vouchers to the local community. And what we found, though, is that even after the first lockdown, that many people who accessed those food services had a continued dependence on those food services. So we think it's really important that we seek to understand exactly why people are experiencing food insecurity during COVID and post, so that we know exactly how to help, because hampers and the delivery of pre-cooked meals aren't a long-term solution. We need to dig into that one a little bit further. The impacts on children and young people. So this is really quite disturbing. the data tells us that there was a 23% increase in reports of children at risk across southwest Sydney after the 2020 lockdown. And the modelling predicts that there will be significantly increased rates of suicide and young people experiencing mental distress across the Macarthur region, much higher than the New South Wales average. And sadly, during the 2020 calendar year, Campbelltown Hospital cared for more mental health presentations than any other hospital across southwest Sydney. So these are really important pieces of information that we need to action. The last piece that I want to mention is a little more positive, and that's around the open space and public domain. So Denise has already given a really great overview of the value of open space and public domain. And it's been a really positive outcome from COVID to see people re-experiencing the joy of open space. So informal and passive recreation is at a high. It's just great that it's given people the cause for new experiences and created some new habits, and people are really valuing their local places, and we really should think about how we can capitalise this. There's so much good that can come of it. So just a little quick mention of what might be needed, but I'm sure that we'll get to this in our deeper conversation a little later. All of these impacts that I've discussed as stresses that have been exacerbated by COVID, they actually existed before COVID came along. So we need strategies to strengthen the resilience of our communities and to address those basic stresses, to reduce the impact and amplify the opportunities so that those stresses are reduced at a time of crisis. So some of the things that we need to talk about particularly are support for digital equity. How do we actually build those social networks, both organically and stimulate organic formation, but also formally, so supported networks. Food security, understanding the dynamics better so we know how to help. And for children and young people, well, this just needs so much more thought. At a minimum, much improved access to mental health facilities, local services locally. And open space and public domain, I'm sure that we'll have a lot more to talk about that in our next session. But I did just want to mention some of the excellent work that's being undertaken by a number of state agencies, including through the Place Design and Public Spaces team, which is coordinated by Carolyn Butler-Bowden, and also the work of Michael Rodriguez, our 24-hour economy commissioner, and then Committee for Sydney and the work that's happening on high streets. That's something that David had already mentioned. There's so much to talk about. But my key message is really a positive one. Let's use data and a structured way of understanding the problems that we need to solve and look through that resilience lens to help build a city that thrives in good times and bad. Thanks, Andy. It's enough from me. I think I've talked enough.
That was great. That was so necessary. I often use the phrase that, COVID didn't create the inequities, it just pulled the curtain back on them, as you've really well illustrated. And I think it's important too that when we think about Western West, we note that none of those 5 areas that you mentioned by way of impact are the things that are typically funded through government. And I would put them, broadly under the category maybe of social infrastructure, but they matter so much more than the things that typically get a check, and I'm thinking about infrastructure, hard infrastructure projects. It is really those things around social isolation, the impacts on children in particular, that I think are urgent issues for government. And it's so good to see Campbelltown being led by the data. I'm frustrated to an extent that entities that have been established to address these issues, and it seems as though the focus very easily strays. And I'm thinking about how we can better support them. I'm thinking about the Greater Sydney Commission, the Western Sydney Parkland City Authority. They're the agencies where government has leverage, and they're not looking at those 5 things with the intensity that you've illustrated is needed. They're not looking at them.
Yep.
And there isn't the urgency that we need out of those agencies, both of those that I've mentioned. So it's one thing that the Committee for Sydney, and I guess all of us collectively, can encourage in them. There's good people in those outfits, but they need to be encouraged to address precisely the 5 things that you identified, Beck. And I'm sure that if we went across to Fairfield, if we went to Bankstown, if we went anywhere through the greater sort of southwest, you'd find the same 5 things. And I do worry, as well as you mentioned, about the longer term impact. Social isolation isn't a kind of click your fingers moment. It's something that resonates and it cascades into so many areas of community life. And it's such a dangerous thing to leave unchecked. The last point I'll make as well is that we need to double down in supporting the Premier, I think, in addressing the social priorities that his predecessor set. She set many priorities in those social areas around advocating for support for children, for domestic violence, increasing Aboriginal access to education, all things that kind of fall under those 5 areas that you mentioned. And then I read this morning in the Herald that less than 50% of those targets have been met.
Yeah.
So government are perhaps looking in the right areas, and I don't know whether they're not supporting their own initiatives sufficiently, but there's a job for us to come in and remind them, you set these priorities, you got to back them in. So certainly, I'll get off the soapbox for a moment, but I just was very inspired by your presentation. You looked in all the right areas, Beck, so thank you so much, and you're doing great work.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to go across now to Tiffany Robertson. And I actually think that we've been leading up to this in some respects when we talk about public domain and we talk about communities and being involved in your community. There's pretty much no other kind of, I think, entity or fabric socially for us in Australia other than sport that has such a galvanising effect for communities. And Tiffany, I'm sure you're going to share with us some of the remarkable stuff that's been going on. And I want to emphasise that community sports have survived through lockdown against all the odds. And I'm sure you'll tell us more about it, but I'm delighted to introduce Tiffany Robertson, the head of AFL, New South Wales ACT. Tiffany, over to you.
Great, thanks Andy. And yeah, really fabulous to listen to the presenters prior to me. I feel like you've all given me a great layup here in terms of the slam dunk around social infrastructure. So Beck, some really great work done there in terms of Campbelltown. I'm going to share a few slides to help this presentation because I'm sure you are all thinking, you know, why AFL and why we're so interested to be a part of discussions such as these. So I'm going to take you through a few slides, but I think it's really important for us when we're discussing recovery in Western Sydney and the impacts of the last 18 months to 2 years. Our purpose is to progress the game so everyone can share in its heritage and possibilities. And nowhere is that more emphasis than in Greater Western Sydney, where obviously as the AFL, we have begun a unique journey out west with the inception of the GWS Giants in approximately 2010. The Giants now have 30,000 members. You see here local hero Haneen Zarika, the first Muslim AFL player to play in AFLW. We've been able to introduce women's footy over the last decade. Excitingly for us, the Giants participate in the AFLW competition. We're excited as well from a New South Wales lens perspective to have the Sydney Swans entering that competition as well. So we are a part of Western Sydney. We are now have one local AFL club in every LGA in Western Sydney, which has been a phenomenal journey for us. And I just wanted to take everyone through. I feel similarly that I need to up front sort of give everyone a bit of a overlook at the AFL's philosophy and what we do really from the grassroots through to the elite. Myself specifically more focused on community and everything sub-elite. So from a participation perspective, you know, our key is to deliver products and content and experiences to our fans and participants that really inspire that next generation of participants and fans. We like to build community infrastructure to support that, you know, places where all Australians want to be a part of, that real sense of belonging that comes, as Andy mentioned, from belonging to your local footy club, your local soccer club. You know, it's really those, you know, those spaces and places where community really comes to life. And doing so, we need to make sure that all of our facilities and those places where people play and socialise and connect, that real heart of the community, how do we make sure that they're inclusive, accessible for all, and make sure that all participants that go to those places have really the opportunity to thrive. It wouldn't be, you know, part of the discussion if we didn't talk about sort of economic impact and the overall premise for the chat today around West Invest and that fund is that sport, like arts and culture, plays a really big part in the economic community. You'll see there from an AFL perspective, nationally, we're over a $3 billion industry, specifically here in New South Wales and the ACT, just slightly under 350 million. So you can see that real impact that we have in sport, right the way from the elite all the way down to our grassroots and community clubs. And I think when we talk recovery and we talk about the impacts of the lockdown, those mental health and physical health and well-being impacts that we know the last 18 months have delivered to our communities, getting community sport back, getting our places and spaces inclusive and accessible to all. We've really seen this renaissance of outdoor, you know, even in our public health orders, talking to outdoor recreation. It's been just a phenomenal to see, you know, the amount of people out enjoying public spaces and outdoor recreation and activity. I think there's a really amazing opportunity for us to all harness that passion and energy and think about getting back to communities and really creating those spaces where people want to be. The next slide here, I just feel it was important to share with the group just some, I guess, observations that we've had from an AFL perspective around, you know, some of the challenges that the recovery or the pandemic has really posed in our space. The first one being competition for attention. So the when we think recovery and we think pandemic, you know, it's a challenge for community sport to get in front of our young Australians who are really more of a digital and online generation. So for us, we need to think about engaging ways and with that might be time of day that you participate, that might be when and how you participate in sport and physical activity, just really that competition for attention is really different. We also see here shifting family dynamics. So we've got cultural, technological and societal changes that are taking place with our families, and none more so than in Greater Western Sydney, which is a highly multicultural population for us. When you think about traditional footy, very much born out of Victoria, we don't have generational legacy here in New South Wales as it relates to AFL. Maybe some of our partners in sport like your NRL, your rugby league, etc., they've got generational support, which is there. For us, when we go into Western Sydney, really building that fandom, that support, that participation base, it's a really different challenge for us at the AFL, and one I think that when participating in discussions such as this, that real challenger nature to getting in and supporting communities, yeah, it really has been for us where, to my fourth bullet point there, you need a very deep and sustained effort. You know, we're not a one sort of flash wonder. We want to be a part of communities. We want to do so in a really considered way. We want those spaces to be where families congregate, where people want to volunteer and really participate more broadly in their community than just on the field. It's also about what we can bring off field as well to those communities. And COVID's really had, you know, a big disruptions for us in terms of the footy ecosystem. One of our big sort of, I guess, from a data perspective, one of our big learnings has been those participants that are connected to a community club are much stickier and wish to return than those participants that may have been just participating in a program such as our Auskick program, as an example, 5 to 8, you're not as much as a part of that community space. And so we've seen really sticky participation. Over 98% of our participants returned this year from our pre-COVID levels, which was an absolutely phenomenal result. But in that school space and in our after-school programs, where we haven't been able to sort of create that sense of community around those participants, parents are making different decisions as it relates to their children's participation in sport and cultural activities, and maybe looking at less number of activities as they change their behaviours coming out of the post-pandemic life. So just like Beck, I've put a number of, I guess, thought starters here forward for the group as we continue the conversation today. But I would really encourage that we need to invest in quality community spaces. That's not only stadia that comes into the debate all the time around the New South Wales lens when we talk to sport, but this is for me more at the local grassroots level about investing in quality community spaces that are inclusive, that are female friendly, that really enable our community clubs to come to life. Things like lighting, egress, things like that, really important for female participants, that they feel safe and that they can use the spaces in a really great way. I'd encourage this group to think about how when we invest in capital investment, we also have to complement that with social infrastructure that supports capital investment. And that was to your point, Andy. It's really important that we think about not only the facility, but who will use it, how they will use it, and really setting up that social infrastructure that can really complement capital investment if it's coming. To my first page, local heroes, you cannot be what you can't see. And that's so important for female participation in sport, for multicultural participation in sport. You know, we are Australia's game as Australian rules football, but we need to do more to represent, you know, the changing face of Australia. And so local heroes and the role that media play in that is really important, that we can highlight those local heroes. We need to listen to our consumers. You know, modern consumers want different things for their kids. And just an interesting point here around millennial parents now becoming the majority. So we've got to think differently. Do they want Friday night sport? They might not want to play Saturday afternoon for 4 hours. They might want an hour, pick up, drop off. And I guess it's up to all of us in the sporting sector and community sector to really think about listening to our consumers. Very important out in Western Sydney when travel is a real, I guess, consideration and barrier to participation in many activities. So important for us to think about. And then my last point here is just around really encouraging that return to membership, to the tribalism of supporting your local club or your professional sporting team. Just how do we proactively support getting back to the stands, the sidelines, you know, that real engaging with like-minded people that want to have fun in a safe space. And that can be really right the way from the elite right down to your grassroots community clubs. So we need people like treasurers, secretaries for local clubs, club presidents, all of that volunteerism and infrastructure that supports community sport. Something for us all to think about a lot, especially with big funding programs coming in, and especially when we think about building schools and infrastructure to support aerotropolis and all of the great things going on out west. We can't think, you know, lose sight of maybe some of those smaller institutions that really build community for our citizens of Western Sydney. Thanks,
Okay.
Andy.
Thanks, Tiffany. That was fantastic. I was a little terrified by the quote unquote millennial parents line. You just dropped that in there. I wasn't prepared. But yes, I think you're right. The dynamics change of parenthood in general in many good ways. I'll get you to drop down your screen and then I'll open up to questions in a moment. So while I blather on for a few minutes, guys, if you can get a few questions and comments ready, use the hand function if you can, otherwise just wave furiously and I'll find you, or stick something on chat as well. A couple of points out of that, and you raised, and I'll go to the slightly negatives first, the barrier around travel. I agree. For Western Sydney, the tyranny of distance is writ large in so many community activities. And even though I kind of suggested that hard infrastructure is probably down the list behind the things that Beck raised, it is important that we have, you know, a far greater emphasis on really quick start transport. So much more by way of transport options for families and those millennial parents, my God. The other one I would talk about as a barrier is heat. And I think heat mitigation in Western Sydney, where, you know, again, we had the hottest day on the planet recorded in Penrith in January 2020, it just says to you that, particularly for community sports, you know, we've got to do something about that in a way that actually not only speaks to the imperatives that were raised at Glasgow, but actually looks at it from a suburban point of view. Basic things like even using building materials in housing developments that actually reflect the heat. Hello, there's a kind of ironic thing to consider. Maybe not, you know, swathes and swathes of black roofed developments right up against one another. And I've actually found as well, you know, the issues around tree canopy are often prevented because the development latitude doesn't allow it. Things are so crammed in that they can't actually get trees into those streets where houses are butted up against one another. So even things like that in supporting community sport, getting kids out of the front yard, even in those environments, is really tricky. So there are two things I would mention. I loved your point about female participation and multicultural participation. It's stronger in Western Sydney, I'd hasten to add, than in many parts of Greater Sydney, simply by virtue of the makeup, the things that make Western Sydney so wonderful, its composition. So multicultural participation is fantastic. I know with female participation, it's also really strong in entrepreneurial activity. In startup culture in Western Sydney, women are in greater numbers than they are anywhere else in startup hubs in the CBD in Sydney. You just don't see them in the numbers they are in Parramatta and Kingswood, in other hubs in Western Sydney. Same goes for sport as well. So it's great to see women really doing well. And Jess's point as well on the chat about pay equity, got to happen. It's why, what the hell? We don't have pay equity. That's bullshit. So that has to happen in sport as well. Okay, so now we've got some questions, and I think that I'm going to go to a friendly face in Ray Duffy-Jones first. I work with Ray at the Centre for Western Sydney. You're all friendly faces, of course. And Ray's our Principal Research Fellow in the Centre, and she's working very, very closely with the Committee for Sydney on an upcoming report we have on Western Sydney. And Ray, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Andy. And I promise this isn't a Dorothy Dixer. So there's no underlying agenda here. Thank you, everyone, for your really fascinating contributions around this issue. I guess to pick up on what Andy was saying, the role of women in kind of building this kind of transformational change that is required in potentially Western Sydney, I think is a really interesting one. I was just catching up with some friends the other day, and the fact that, you know, during the lockdown, schools were refusing to take a child whose mother was, you know, managing an ICU unit because, you know, the dad was at home still working his full-time job. And in the end, they had to turn to, you know, out-of-hours school care to take the child rather than the education system. So I think that speaks to a much bigger problem around, you know, the fact that the already existing government structures are not supporting women. And if we're talking about the recovery for Western Sydney and the fact that women have been so negatively impacted by the impact of COVID, I wonder how, from all your perspectives, how we can bring women into the centre of this, and how, you know, an infrastructure change, but also, you know, access to public space. I'm thinking, Tiffany, even with the AFL, why the AFL might not want to consider connecting with some of these USH providers as a way of building, you know, young people's connection to the game. Denise, you know, the public spaces and young people, number of people who said that they'd never really visited their local parks until lockdown, and then were suddenly amazed at what beautiful spaces there were available in these areas. And yeah, I guess I'm just interested in all the speakers' perspectives around, you know, particularly some of these, you know, women are not just, you know, a minority. We're talking about 50% of the population. Yet I reckon if you really kind of dug in and found some of those pinch points that we learnt through COVID, how all the agendas that you're speaking to could actually be operationalised by focusing on that.
Great point, Ray. I'm going to go to the panelists first. Tiffany, I might go to you, given that Ray mentioned you in her question.
Yeah, Ray, thank you for the question. It's such an amazing point about the power of women and girls in terms of recovery. From an AFL perspective, I think what we've noticed is, you know, our participation journey and growth over the last 5 years has been fueled in the main part by our women's football growth. So from the days of no professional league to now, we've been able to, in New South Wales in 5 years, really restore a pathway from Auskick right the way through to the professional game. Now we've got, and points taken, Jess and Elizabeth, we've got a ways to go to get our female athletes to be fully professional athletes. They're still semi-professional at times, working other jobs outside of the season. We made a distinct decision this year to move the time of our season to the summer season so that there would be no overlap with the AFL men's season, to really give prominence to the women's game and what we are doing to drive that game to the nth degree with our broadcast partners, etc. I do think role modeling is really important for us through the pandemic, and a way to build participation is really to bring girls in at a really young age to the sport. We're still, they're coming into the funnel at all ages at the moment, but building that base is really important for us to be able to then see longevity. What we do see with girls' participation is a lot of factors really come into their decision to continue, and I think there's a lot more learning to be done there with a number of people on this call around the role of coaches, the role of facilities. We still have too many. So 75% of AFL venues are not female friendly. We're working with Jess Miller and a lot of councils, Campbelltown, others, to really work on that, because that's not an experience that I'm proud of. I want everyone who participates in the AFL to be able to do so. And they shouldn't, as a female, have to change in the car park or in the car, because, in the 70s, we didn't put female-friendly facilities into an oval because cricket was played there and AFL was played there back in the day. So we've got a lot of work to do around that. And my last point, and then I'll throw on, would be there's also a really exciting opportunity around the the Soccer World Cup coming and predominantly being hosted in New South Wales in 2023. Now, it's kind of rare for me but a huge shout out to that opportunity. I think even the AFL benefits from that halo effect of us having that world-class competition. I'm sure that there's a neat opportunity for Western Sydney to leverage that opportunity as well, just considering the generational support for football in terms of the round ball out there. So it's a really neat lens to think about the challenge about making sure that when we're thinking recovery, we're really focusing on women and girls.
Great to see the cross-code support, Tiffany. Very, very good. Very, very important, I think. And actually, what we've seen by way of an announcement around rugby league payments to women for the state of origin, I think, is also a fantastic point. I'm going to take a quick comment from David, and then I'm going to go to Sean Mack. And David.
Well, thanks. I was going to say, one thing that strikes me as interesting about Western Sydney is that the female participation rate is lower than just about any other place in Australia. It's very, very low. It's much lower than Eastern Sydney. And so understanding why women are participating less in Western Sydney, I think, is really important. And presumably some of it has to do with the distance between people and jobs. And so one of the things we did learn from the last 2 years was that, not all of us, but some of us can work from home more often. And I hope that those flexible arrangements can continue. And that means that women living in Oran Park or areas that don't have a lot of jobs get a bigger choice, because we do find the participation rate for people falls off the further they are away from employment. So I hope that's a bit of a game changer that can really create a more inclusive society in Western Sydney.
Yeah, thanks, David. I couldn't agree more. That's one of the big areas of focus for the Centre for Western Sydney. We think that increasing the potential for women to participate in the economy is one of the biggest catalytic things you can do as a government. And I saw a little bit of an announcement from Matt Keane about that last week, but we need to really amplify it massively, because it can have such a transformative effect if you just enable that. you could spend the whole $5 billion on it and it'll be $5 billion very, very well spent. Okay, I'm going to go to Sean Mack. And I mentioned earlier that the Committee for Sydney and the Centre for Western Sydney and other partners are working on what's tentatively called a Progress and Prospects report on Western Sydney. And Sean's been doing a lot of that work for us. And Sean, you got a question or a comment?
Well, it's a question to all of the panels, but it comes off some of the comments that Rebecca made. The digital divide that we knew was there anyway, but the COVID really exposed it. How do we bridge that? Can we use some of the $5 billion that's been flagged to help bridge that gap? And also, is there an opportunity with the rollout of 5G just try and close that gap? But is also 5G an opportunity that we might miss? Because from what I understand, most of the 5G kit is going into the denser inner city and eastern suburbs. And how do we overcome that?
Yeah, great point. I'm going to go to Beck first, given I think Campbelltown, Beck, had the record for receiving the most dongles, quote unquote, emergency dongles during lockdown. So just big gaps, unforgivable gaps in soft infrastructure down there. Beck.
Yeah, look, well, I'm actually hoping that there's someone online that can give us some insight into an approach for this, because it doesn't matter who we advocate to, actually having more of a focus on, there's a difference between equity and equality. And we need to make sure that focus of where the investment's going at the moment is not just based on current need. I mean, how can I say this? We're continuing to build stereotypes by assuming that current trends are informing need rather than thinking about what future need is. So, just that digital infrastructure is a classic example. There's the Wi-Fi infrastructure itself, but then there's also access and affordability of devices. So one of the biggest limitations through COVID was where we had families who have one computer in their home with multiple children and parents working from home all needing to access the same device at the same time. So that was a real issue. There's stories from TAFE where people from TAFE were indicating that apprenticeships, particular trades, were dropping off in their participation because they were trying to do their courses on their mobile phones. But that's just crazy. There needs to be some level of support or intervention to make sure that people actually have access to the devices as well as the digital infrastructure. I'm happy to hear if anyone's got any ideas and how we can explore that further as a group. It is a real issue.
Absolutely. And as by way of infrastructure investments, there's probably no more urgent one to make. It's really like oxygen in terms of, certainly the early childhood development gaps as well that are occurring in that space are really troubling. And I remember a federal government some time ago tried a stimulus package with the issuing of free laptops, and boy, did they attract criticism. I'll leave that open. Any other comments on digital infrastructure? Really good point, Sean. Cool. All right. Look, I might go around the room to the panelists. We'll try and finish up a little bit early if we can. I'm going to start with you, David, so get ready. Just some final comments, really, if you can. And please don't think this is the last word. Anyone out there who wants to add anything or raise any other issues, please do so. But David, just something you might want to have us consider in wrapping up around your earlier presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, I think it's great that there actually is this fund. Like, it's a large fund, it's really significant, and we don't just want to have more spending, we want to have smarter spending. So I think the process that the government puts in place to determine the applications is really, really important. And I do think groups like the Committee for Sydney and our own group, the uni and others, can, if we join together, we can have a bit of influence on this. What we don't want is the program being designed in the back of a minister's office on the back of an envelope for whatever reason. I'm not suggesting for the wrong reasons. And we actually find this $5 billion is frittered away, and actually at the end of it, we can't really point to anything, any lasting social change in Western Sydney. So I think it's a great opportunity. And I guess the other challenge is it's not going to do everything. I mean, if you divide, I think there's 2.3 million people in the 15 areas of concern. If you divide the $5 billion of that, think there's about $2,000 per person, which seems like a lot of money, but if we're not strategic, we will blow it. And to be honest with you, just all the great ideas I've heard today is starting to make me think we actually can't do everything. That's the problem. So we're going to have to make some tough decisions.
Yeah, I agree. And the point I've been saying to anyone who'll listen is that 5 billion isn't the last word. We should be having $5 billion levels of investment in Western Sydney on an annual basis. I'm not being facetious there, given the concentration of growth and given the kind of issues that I think Rebecca in particular highlighted really well. You know, 5 billion is a down payment. It's the down payment. I'm going to go to Denise and ask the same of you. It's the wrap-up time. So anything that you'd like us to take away with us in addition to what you shared with us earlier?
Yeah, so I think the biggest, I guess, impact or influence we can support is creating accessible spaces that are safe. The safety element to us is really important. Equitable access is a really important thing for us. Annan's a really complicated space. You really do need to get there by vehicle. And I know there's bus services, but we've really got to get a lot better at creating this equitable outcome. The other thing when we talk about our population, I know we say there's 50%, women tend to live a lot longer, or probably because we drive most men insane, if that's what they say, but it's not true. But a really big thing for us in the community is how are we helping our older generation, and things through volunteering, community support. And Tiffany, I love everything AFL does. I think out of all the codes, and don't say you couldn't have your favourite, even though I do like soccer, but AFL does reach out to community. And the one thing that we try and do is create opportunities for all ages to find a place that feels safe, where I belong, and that I'm actually I'm making a difference. And to most people, that isolation and that impact that's particularly come out of COVID, loneliness, how can we create great spaces where people can come? The support for our First Nations is a really big thing for me. And the other one, which we may not have touched upon yet, but Western Sydney just has such an enormous opportunity to create this wonderful change in STEM education. And Western Sydney, in its remit as an agricultural incredible space, we've got an opportunity to create some increase in females into the STEM area, but also wonderful trades in horticulture and things like that. So there's so much we can do. And the one thing I always say is we can invest in roads and everything, and that's wonderful. Social infrastructure and supporting communities to be resilient is such a starting point, because you actually leverage from that to create much better outcomes.
Thanks, Denise. And I can assure you, women had nothing to do with my insanity. It's completely my own. I'm sure David would join me in that comment. And I'm going to go to Tiffany in a moment, and then Rebecca to finish this off. But before I do, there's a couple of more questions that have just come up, and they're really good ones. So I'm going to go quickly to Tenzin for your question. Tenzin.
Oh, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Yeah,
Switch on your screen too, if you can, Tenzin.
Yeah, sure. So it's more of a comment, I guess, but yeah, I guess in the frame as a question as well. So I guess it was, so definitely appreciate all the speakers, insight and the dedication to Western Sydney. I couldn't help but notice that the cultural diversity of Western Sydney doesn't seem to be fully represented. So, so I guess the question is, because all the development obviously, is meant to serve the community, right? So then the question is, what is being done to incorporate the voices of the culturally and linguistically diverse communities into recovery plans?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I completely agree with you. I think that one of the faults in the parliamentary system we have in Australia is that there hasn't been enough done to encourage culturally diverse representation and female representation as well. And Western Sydney, I think, is very, very ripe for that kind of support. And I think that when we see situations in pre-selection where local candidates on both sides of Parliament aren't supported in representing their own communities, I think that's a real problem. And structurally, you just don't have a reflection of Western Sydney at the state or federal Parliament. Our parliamentarians don't look like Western Sydney. As for this presentation, I agree too. I agree we need to have more diverse voices here. The question of leadership through universities, through local government, through the state government, and through business peaks as well, needs to get better at representing multicultural Western Sydney. We're failing. We're not doing it well enough at the moment. So all I can say is mea culpa, and we're trying. But I'm going to just quickly go to any other panelists who might want to touch on this issue. Is there anything anyone else would like to add other than we can get better?
Yeah, I might just add a couple of words. Look, I think it's easy for well-intentioned people to make assumptions on what might be in the best interests of broader communities. But it's only if we really, truly, deeply engage with people to understand exactly what their needs and wants are that we can properly support and include people in the solutions and in the delivery. There's no other way to do it. I think, and I was mentioning earlier around an evidence-based approach, there is no one size fits all. We must be making sure that we're, sure, some of those issues are consistent and common across all of Western Sydney, that some of those things that I raised, but the nuances are different area to area, you know, and even just from a food security perspective, as an example, the difference in food security issues, needs and solutions for Campbelltown compared to Fairfield are actually very different. We can wrap it up into a bigger problem statement, but the solutions aren't necessarily consistent. We can learn from them, and we should be having those conversations, but it isn't ever a one size fits all. Yeah,
agreed. So that's an area where I think we need to get better. I totally agree. I think we might go to a question from Christopher Tour, and then we'll get into the home stretch. Christopher, if you're still there, could you put your question or comment?
Thanks, Andy. Look, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of those issues there, and Tenzin in particular. Funding infrastructure is great, but from an arts and cultural perspective, it's actually funding people, and the people of Sydney or Western Sydney, that and the artists and the arts organisations. And so let's not leave them. Politicians love to fund things they can open. You don't get to open arts companies or artists, but there's no point opening things if there's no one there to actually use them. And the biggest opportunity that exists to grow the cultural sector across Western Sydney is organisations and artists. They'll then find the venues, they'll make the venues, they'll use the gardens, they'll use the spare warehouses, and in the end, governments will build venues for them. But we need to ensure that there is a strong investment over the next decade in the artists of the region telling their stories.
Yeah, completely agree. It shouldn't ever be seen as an also-ran, and it so often is in government. Yeah. It's top of the list, I think. And certainly, David, you mentioned that as well. I'm going to go quickly to you, David, and then to Tiffany, and then Rebecca, and then we'll finish up. David. Oh, no,
look, I completely agree with what Chris said, and I think we should take that on board. If the committee are making a submission or other groups around here, then I think we should take on board that point. I mean, it's always struck me. I know this is a bit of a left field point, but Western Sydney doesn't have a youth circus. We have national ones. We have circuses all around the country. We don't actually have one locally. You'd think with 2 million people and a huge young population that they're the sorts of things that we should have.
The next generation of Australians artists are living in the centre of Sydney, being Western Sydney. That's where they live, and it is the right fertile ground where all of our next brilliant artists will come from. And that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely, and they won't wait. There's a groundswell that has an inevitability about it. I'm going to go to Tiffany and then to you, Beck. Tiffany, just some last comments from you.
Thanks, Andy. Some really great points there raised around multiculturalism and working in the sector that really gets to partners and industry and others that can support government in order to achieve their goals that they need. That's why the AFL chooses to be a member for Committee for Sydney, because this is a really great opportunity to engage with government and to think about the role that we all play in bringing to life community, whether that be arts, culture or sport. Please do think of you know, organisations such as ours, the sporting sector, arts, etc., that will be around to bring these bring to life the communities. I think that's really important to think about when you're thinking about that broader funding package of just not capital investment, roads, etc., but that second layer of how that comes to life. So I've really enjoyed the conversation today to echo those points. And I think one that I've really taken on board would be the women and girls discussion. And then we do continuously work on representation in our organisation for our multicultural and diverse communities. And I think a really important point and one role that we all have to play around, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I think that that's really important in all sectors. So something that we focus on a lot with organisations such as Multicultural New South Wales and others that do that really well around in language support, around helping us with cultural competency and other things in our sporting club infrastructure. So some really great points raised today, Andy. I've got nothing more to add. I've learned a lot today myself as well.
Oh, no, you've been terrific, Tiffany, and thanks. I think you've really helped us to come away with a bit of a consensus on the fact that, and this might surprise governments because it goes against political logic. No one here is voting, for I guess the hard infrastructure. The stuff that's at the top of the list, I think, that's emerged today has been social infrastructure. It's been that stuff that's community centred and people focused, and you've emphasised that really, really well. And I'm going to go to Beck because I think you just raised, as I mentioned, those themes around what we've discovered through COVID, as by way of how pre-existing inequities have in some respects worsened. I don't want to end on a negative note because I know there's a lot to be encouraged by. But what can you leave us with by way of a parting comment and maybe next steps for us all?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think with immunisation and the decreasing rates of infection, we could safely say that the crisis of this current wave of COVID is on its way down. So we're not talking crisis now. What we're talking about is, we're not talking the shock, we're talking about the stress. And how do we actually work to mitigate those existing stresses that exist across all of Western Sydney so that we can build a more resilient community, more resilient organisations, more resilient businesses that are able to deal with those stresses, but also then more comfortably deal with the shocks when they emerge. It's not if they emerge, it's when they emerge. And it might be COVID, it could be, the layer of the bushfire, the drought, urban heat as a real issue. So I think that collectively we need to consider not just recovery, but the idea of how do we build resilience to be able to deal with crises into the future. So I know that Resilient Sydney are doing a fantastic job. There's a really good network organisation that exists around that. And I know that there was a state agency established around resilience as well. However, I'd like to see further work through that agency, really considering not just mop up, but actually thinking about resilience in its truest sense. So that's probably my parting thought, is resilience in its true sense needs to be considered here.
I totally agree. And I mentioned earlier where I think the Committee for Sydney, the Greater Sydney Commission and the Western Parkland City Authority could redirect their efforts. And I'd actually add to that Resilience New South Wales. We've seen all manner of new government entities spring up in the last 5 to 10 years. It's unusual for, I think, a Conservative government to go in for such a big array of entities. But this is their chance. It's their chance to double down. It's their chance to refocus their efforts. And I completely agree with you. That's the right area to look at. Just in closing, I want to thank all of you for your comments and your really wonderful suggestions. As I mentioned earlier, it is really clear that the priorities that are emerging for West Invest are social and community-based, and certainly a really strong emphasis on freeing up the participation of women in the economy and in community more broadly. What a catalytic thing that would be if we're able to do that. And again, as usual, lead from the West. So in closing, there's not much more for me to do other than to thank our panellists. So Rebecca, David, Tiffany and Denise, absolutely wonderful insights. And again, I learn something every time in these sessions. So thanks, guys, as panellists. A really special thanks to Hassan, Gabe and all of the committee and Michael Rose and co. You continually put on these events and they're thought-provoking and they're useful, and I think we need more of them in consolidating our approaches, particularly in Western Sydney. Thank you to Anna Burns in particular for making it all work. Anna, your planning and everything in between is always exceptional. And so thank you so much for everything that you do. And thanks everyone who joined us. We're going to do more of these. Of course, we'll start to wind down towards the end of the year, but stay tuned for Progress and Prospects. I promise it's only a working title. It sounds like a Dickens novel. It's never going to fly. We'll come up with something far better. But that's a report, as I mentioned, that will look to today's conversation and consolidate a lot of that. And we'll be in touch with you as that progresses. That's about it. Go and enjoy your afternoon. Have a walk, have a wander. The tradies have gone, so Kiss FM has left the building. Thank Christ for that. It was driving me insane. There's only so much soft rock you can take in an afternoon at home. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Stay safe, keep well. Bye-bye.